I'm fairly familiar with out-of-body experiences, although I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I have been having OOBEs my entire life, at least since I was 6. But it's only been recently that I've started to pay attention to a particular characteristic of the OOB experience that I don't really understand, or at least I never really thought about up until fairly recently. It's very common for people, when they leave their body, to interact with their new reality in a way quite different from the way they interact with their daily material reality. And you can see this also in the accounts of people who have had NDE experiences, usually from a traumatic accident or on the surgery table or something like that. And they go to this other reality, and it's amazing, and they explain it in great detail, and the things they do and the things they see. And then when they come back, they often wonder, why didn't they do this or that? Or why did they do this or that? Why didn't they ask obvious questions? Why didn't they investigate more the things that they would normally be curious about in their human consciousness, but in this other consciousness seemed unimportant or irrelevant or just commonplace? It's almost as if they had a different personality when out of the body, as if they were a different person. In my own case, I have found myself doing things I would never do in my human consciousness. For example, once out of my body, I saw what I believed to be a parasitic entity attached to a friend of mine. It was really large, and my initial reaction when out of body was to attack it, which I did in order to save my friend. It responded by throwing my astral body halfway across New York City with almost no effort at all on its part. Now, in the physical world, my first reaction would never be attack. So why would I do that when out of my body? Years later, actually decades later, and fairly recently, I was accosted by a malevolent entity, I guess is the best way we could say it, and I responded in the most brutal and vicious manner, which when I came back to my body, I was really I was shocked, I was a little embarrassed, and I was also a little nervous that type of energy, that type of response could be something that existed within me. On the other side of the spectrum, there have been times that I have left my body with a full conscious to-do list of things I wanted to do and felt I needed to do while I was out. But as soon as I got out, I couldn't remember any of those things. I was like a different person. And in some cases, no matter how excited I was to get out of my body, as soon as I was out, there have been times I've been bored. There was one time I popped out of my body and I just floated around my room. I had absolutely no inspiration or intention or motivation to do anything. I interacted with a cat for a little bit and then was like, this is a drag. And I went back into my body. And as soon as I got back into my body, my human consciousness was like, what the hell, man? What were you thinking over there? My most recent experience with this kind of split personality kind of a thing is I have found over, I guess, the past year that when I'm out of my body, I seem to act in a kind of childish and embarrassing way. Kind of a bit of aggressive, impetuous, and inconsiderate. Now, I don't know if I was always like that. I mean, maybe I was and I didn't see it. Kind of the same way children can be obnoxious when they're little, and they don't see it, but they do when they grow up. But the more disturbing aspect of that is if I consider my out-of-body consciousness a higher consciousness, which I do, or at least a more encompassing consciousness, it's kind of humbling to recognize the fact that my higher self can be a really obnoxious jerk at times. Of course, there are also times that I, or my higher self, has acted in ways far superior than my human self, showing a level of wisdom and empathy and bravery that's far beyond anything that my human form is capable of. But the point of all this is that once outside the body, you're not the same person, personality, consciousness that you are when you're in the body. And when I say you, I'm generalizing because there are those who have integrated their human and non-human, or perhaps we should refer to it as neurologically based and non-neurologically based consciousnesses, in a way where they work together, where they are integrated, interactive, and harmonious with each other. But I also suspect that's not the majority of the cases. I, like most others who have out-of-body experiences, perceive both the earthly consciousness and the astral or out-of-body consciousness as aspects of ourselves, of who we are, of our singular identity as an existence. But it's difficult to understand how the I, in quotes, could exhibit so many different non-integrated instances of quote-unquote my consciousness. One reasonable answer was that these different instances of being, all of which I considered me, were not really me as we understand that concept in ordinary day-to-day lives. These other consciousnesses, they just felt like me because there was a continuity of perspective. If I was experiencing that instance of consciousness, then whatever I was me, simply because I was on the inside looking out. I guess it would kind of be like you're in a car, it's your car. When you're driving it, it's your car. One day you're driving a Ferrari, and next day you're driving a Corolla. When you're driving, they're both your cars at that moment, simply by virtue of the fact that you're sitting in the driver's seat, controlling it. But to say that, well, these are all just different aspects of who I am, of the larger being of myself, has different personalities or aspects or consciousnesses or perspectives or whatever. They're all just part of me. To say that depends on the idea. To have such an idea depends on the assumption that I am a unique, solitary, independent being. But when you start digging into that concept of I or me, it doesn't really hold up. Our instance, either in our physical form or otherwise, is a conglomeration of many, many other instances of other conglomerations, which are themselves made of conglomerations, and so on and so on, so on and so on. What you call you, what I call me, is a countless number of functions and processes and organs and you name it that allow this entity that we call me or I to even exist. And that includes, aside from the organs and the cells and the systems, the countless number of bacteria and even parasites that live in our system that are required for us to live. I mean, not only are there over 10,000 microbial species that live in our body, but our bodies are about 90% bacteria. Of the 30 trillion cells in our bodies, less than a third are actually human, or as we define the word. The other 70 to 90% are bacterial and fungal. And of the unique genes in our body, 99% of them are non-human. Only about 1% of our genes are exclusively human. So, in short, the concept of I is just that. It's a concept that we created out of necessity to survive in the world. This is not to say that the concept of I is an illusion or a lie. I is an expression of our awareness of existence. But existence is the one attribute shared by everything that does exist. What this means then, at least from the tholonic perspective, is that as everything was and is created by awareness, then it stands that everything that exists is an instance of awareness, and therefore existence itself is awareness. The fact that we have a meta-consciousness that evolved the ability to say, I exist, does not mean all else that does not have the concept, I exist, does not exist. It simply means that all else doesn't have the ability to be aware of their existence. Because it is the brain that says, I am, then obviously the brain cannot conceive of anything without a brain as having awareness. It's not that the brain is wrong, it's just misinformed, which is why we believe that awareness is a byproduct of our neurology, when in reality, our neurology is a byproduct of awareness. It's not, I am the source of awareness. It's, I am a creation of awareness. Getting back to our question of multiple consciousnesses, if anyone has seriously played video games, especially in virtual reality, they understand this split consciousness idea fairly well, albeit in a more limited context. As a player character, you may be a killing machine whose only goal is to wreak havoc and destruction on the enemy. And while you're playing, you are 100% committed to that reality. The concerns and desires of your other consciousness, as an IT consultant, office manager, weed dealer, whatever, can only stand idly by until you stop playing. This is also true for athletes or musicians, artists, writers, developers, or any work that requires complete and undivided attention. Even if you make a career out of playing games, or sports, or music, or whatever, a mundane consciousness operates within the culture you live in and demands your attention to day-to-day tasks and customs to maintain itself. Tyler Blevins, who plays games professionally under the name Ninja, or at least did at one time, is not thinking about the $17 million he pulls down each year when he's in the game killing people left and right. Nor does he address his real-life issues with a plasma grenade launcher. But what would Ninja think about Tyler's everyday life? What would that character, if that character had a consciousness and became aware of itself and then realized that its higher self was Tyler Blevins, a skinny green-haired nerd? I bet Ninja would have some serious issues with that. It would be a real existential crisis for Ninja. Leaving our body shifts our awareness into the astral body or soul body or whatever you want to call it, within which the physical body and physical consciousness exists, similar to how Ninja exists within Tyler. If Ninja left his body, he would discover he was in the consciousness of Tyler. Likewise, when we leave our body, we can find ourselves in a consciousness that is quite different from the consciousness formed by the nature and nurture of our genetics and culture. And it may be very surprising, this consciousness. And we might actually discover that our human consciousness is actually more mature, more evolved, more conscientious than our expanded, larger consciousness. We typically have the idea that our higher consciousness is the superior one, is the wiser one, is the more divine one. But my experience suggests that's not necessarily the case, and that perhaps our human consciousness is as much of a teacher for our higher consciousness, almost as if our higher consciousness instantiated into this quote-unquote lower, denser form of reality in order to learn. And as a result of this learning that we do down here, we can transmit that, share that, essentially teach our non-physical consciousness, being, awareness of the lessons that we have learned while in the physical world, which I suspect can be a lot tougher than the lessons we learn in the non-physical world. Using this metaphor of the split consciousness between Tyler Blevins and Ninja, applying that to our reality would suggest that metaphorically, this reality is like a simulation. That is not to say it is a simulation, but it does act like one. Calling our physical reality a simulation, as in a imitation of a situation or process, is both inaccurate and accurate. It's inaccurate to the degree that it suggests that reality is not quote-unquote real. But it is accurate in that just how our physical bodies exist within our astral bodies, the physical world exists within an astral world. Ironically, this bleeding-edge scientific theory of the universe as a simulation seems to be more like a 21st century version of the 2,000-year-old Gnostic alchemical concept of as above, so below. But by the same token, and maybe this is a very liberal revision of this ancient law, as below, so above. So what's the takeaway from all this? Well, one of the takeaways is consciousness is a product of context, or what we consider consciousness. I am me, you are you, I'm a mechanic, you're a dancer, etc., etc. These consciousnesses that we have are bound to the culture that we live in. You would not have the same consciousness as a human if you were a Vietnamese rice picker in the 60s, or if you were an Inuit whaler from the 12th century. To some degree, we can determine what part of our consciousness is culturally based simply by removing all cultural dependencies on our identity of who we are. And when you do that, it's kind of surprising. You're left with not much. Or it seems like not much from the human perspective, because really all you're left with, once you take away all of the cultural dependencies and all of the contexts where who you are exists within, there's not much more left than just awareness. Ninja is a killing machine because that's the context of the world he lives in. Tyler Blevins is a gamer because that's the context of the world he lives within. They're both the same consciousness, or they both come from the same awareness. Were Tyler Blevins to leave his body, he would experience a consciousness that had nothing to do with his earthly existence, but would be relevant to whatever the context is of the reality that his higher consciousness exists within. And the context of his higher consciousness could be as radically different to his human consciousness as his human consciousness is radically different from Ninja's warrior consciousness. Of course, we're assuming Ninja has a consciousness, but which of course in today's world he doesn't, but in the near future those AI characters may well be developing their own consciousness. The reality of the situation is we are like Ninja. We exist within the context of this physical reality, but the consciousness that created who we are in this reality is in a different context. And to make things even a little more twisted, it doesn't have to be a singular consciousness. It could be multiple consciousnesses, or put it another way, it could be a consciousness in multiple contexts, that this consciousness in the physical reality, in the physical context, is an instance of or exists within. Sort of in the same way, our physical body is an instance of many, many, many thousands of different types of independent living organisms. The fungus, the bacteria, the microbials, etc., etc. So I guess the bottom line to all of this is, if you take away all the contextual dependencies, what are we left with? Well, just awareness. And as everything is awareness, when you take away all of the context, essentially there's no difference between the awareness from which your current identity emerged from and anything else that exists in the universe, because existence is a byproduct of awareness. You no longer are you. You are everything because you are just awareness.